The sound of a train whistle echoed through the crisp autumn air as Eleanor Blackwood stood alone on the Dry Creek station platform, her white wedding dress collecting dust in the late afternoon sun. She checked her pocket watch for the 20th time in the last hour, the hands showing 4:30. Frederick was 3 hours late. Eleanor clutched the telegram in her gloved hand, reading the words that had given her hope just days ago. Arriving Thursday 1 o'clock. Ready to make you Mrs. Thompson. With love, Frederick. Now those words felt hollow as the empty tracks stretched endlessly before her. Miss? Station's closing soon. The station master called, his voice tinged with pity. Last train's already gone through. Won't be another until morning. Eleanor nodded, fighting back tears. She'd traveled all the way from Boston to this dusty Wyoming town, sold everything she owned, and now stood abandoned. The few remaining passengers had long departed, leaving her alone with her trunk and the dying light of day. I just need a few more minutes, she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The station master nodded and disappeared back into his office. The wind picked up, sending dust swirling around her skirts. Eleanor closed her eyes, wondering what she would do now. No money, no family, and a fiancé who apparently had changed his mind. Waiting for someone, a deep voice asked from behind her. Eleanor turned to see a tall man standing a few feet away. His clothes were trail-worn, a dust-covered denim shirt, leather vest, and chaps that had seen better days. A weathered Stetson was pulled low over his eyes, but she could see he was studying her carefully. Yes, but I don't believe he's coming, she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. The stranger stepped closer, and Eleanor could now see his face clearly tanned from the sun, with a strong jaw covered in a few days' stubble. His eyes were a striking blue that reminded her of the summer sky in Massachusetts. Wade Callahan. He introduced himself, tipping his hat. Can't help but notice you've been standing here since noon. Eleanor Blackwood. She replied with as much dignity as she could muster. And yes, I was supposed to meet my fiancé. He was coming on the 1 o'clock train. Wade's expression softened. No man worth his salt leaves a lady waiting like this, especially one dressed for a wedding. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. Perhaps there was an emergency, or a mistake with the trains. Wade's eyes drifted to the telegram still clutched in her hand, but said nothing. Do you have somewhere to stay tonight, Miss Blackwood? He asked. The question brought Eleanor's predicament into sharp focus. She had planned to be Mrs. Frederick Thompson by nightfall, settled into whatever arrangements her new husband had made. Now, as the sun began to set, she realized she had nowhere to go. I'm afraid not, she admitted, her voice small. Wade removed his hat, running a hand through his sandy brown hair. There's a boarding house in town. Mrs. Miller runs it, good woman, fair prices. He paused. I'd be happy to escort you there. Eleanor looked at the empty tracks one last time, then back at Wade. In Boston, she would never consider accepting help from a stranger, especially one as rough-looking as this cowboy. But this wasn't Boston, and she wasn't the same sheltered young woman who had boarded the train 3 days ago. That's very kind of you, Mr. Callahan. Wade picked up her trunk with ease. Just Wade, miss. Nobody calls me Mr. Callahan except the bank manager when I'm late on payments. His smile was warm, revealing a small dimple in his left cheek. Eleanor gathered her courage and her skirts. As Wade offered his arm, she hesitated only briefly before placing her hand on it. Let me take you home, Miss Blackwood, he said softly. At least for tonight. The walk into Dry Creek was quiet. Eleanor was acutely aware of the stares they received. A woman in a wedding dress being escorted by a dusty cowboy was apparently quite the spectacle in this small town. Main Street consisted of a general store, a saloon, a small bank, and various other establishments typical of frontier towns in 1883. It's not much, Wade said, seeming to read her thoughts, but it's growing. Railroads bringing more folks west every month. It seems charming, Eleanor offered, trying to be polite despite her disappointment and exhaustion. Wade chuckled. That's a kind way of putting it. Rough around the edges is what most folks say. They arrived at a 2-story clapboard house with a small sign reading Miller's Boarding House. Wade set down her trunk and knocked on the door. A plump woman with graying hair answered, her eyes widening at the sight before her. Wade Callahan, what trouble have you brought to my doorstep now? She asked, though her tone was more amused than angry. "Mrs. Miller, this is Miss Eleanor Blackwood. She needs a room for the night. Maybe longer." Mrs. Miller's eyes softened as she took in Eleanor's wedding dress and forlorn expression. "Oh, you poor dear. Come in, come in." Eleanor stepped into the warm entryway, the smell of fresh bread making her realize how hungry she was. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller. And thank you, Mr. Calloway." She corrected herself. "I don't know what I would have done." Wade replaced his hat, just doing what any decent man would do. He turned to leave, then paused. "Miss Blackwood, if you need anything, I have a small ranch about 3 miles east of town. Anyone can point you in the right direction." With that, he was gone, leaving Eleanor standing in a strange house in a strange town, wondering how her life had taken such an unexpected turn. Mrs. Miller showed Eleanor to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Bathrooms down the hall. Dinner's at 6, but I can bring something up if you'd prefer to rest." "Thank you, but I'll come down," Eleanor replied. "And Mrs. Miller, I should tell you, I don't have much money, just what I brought for emergencies." The older woman patted her hand. "Let's not worry about that now. Get yourself settled and come down when you're ready." Alone in the room, Eleanor finally allowed herself to cry. She removed her wedding dress carefully, hanging it in the small wardrobe. As she changed into a simple blue day dress from her trunk, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. Her dark hair had come loose from its elaborate style, and her eyes were red-rimmed from tears. "What now, Eleanor?" she whispered to herself. After washing her face and composing herself, she made her way downstairs to the dining room, where several other boarders were already seated. Conversation stopped as she entered, and Eleanor felt her cheeks flush under their curious stares. "Everyone, this is Miss Blackwood," Mrs. Miller announced, guiding her to an empty seat. "She's just arrived in town." Murmured greetings followed as Eleanor sat down. The other boarders included a young schoolteacher, an elderly gentleman who worked at the bank, and a middle-aged couple who owned the general store. "We saw you with Wade Callahan," the shopkeeper's wife said. "How do you know him?" "I don't, really," Eleanor admitted. "He was kind enough to escort me here when I found myself stranded." "Wade's a good man," the elderly banker commented. "Keeps to himself mostly, but always willing to help a neighbor in need." "What brings you to Dry Creek, Miss Blackwood?" the schoolteacher asked. Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I was meeting someone who didn't arrive." Understanding dawned on their faces, and mercifully, they changed the subject. As they ate Mrs. Miller's hearty stew and fresh bread, the conversation turned to local gossip and news. Eleanor learned that Dry Creek had been founded just 12 years earlier when silver was discovered in the nearby mountains. The boom had been short-lived, but the town survived primarily as a stop on the railroad and a supply point for local ranchers. After dinner, Eleanor excused herself and returned to her room. She sat by the window, looking out at the unfamiliar landscape bathed in moonlight. The vast openness of Wyoming was so different from the crowded streets of Boston. She felt both terrified and strangely liberated. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Miller entered with a cup of tea. "Thought you might need this," she said, setting the cup on the bedside table. "And perhaps a friendly ear." Eleanor smiled gratefully. "You're very kind." "It's not kindness, dear. I was young once, too." Mrs. Miller sat on the edge of the bed. "Want to tell me what happened?" The story poured out of Eleanor how she'd met Frederick Thompson when he came to Boston on business, their whirlwind courtship, and his proposal 3 months later. He'd returned west to prepare their home, sending for her when everything was ready. "I sold my parents' house they passed last year and used most of the money for the journey. Frederick promised everything would be perfect when I arrived." Eleanor sighed. "Now I'm here with barely enough money for a week's board and no idea what to do next." Mrs. Miller patted her hand. "First things first, get some rest. Tomorrow, we'll figure something out. Dry Creek might be small, but we take care of our own." "But I'm not one of your own," Eleanor pointed out. "You are now, dear," Mrs. Miller replied with a warm smile. "You are now." The next morning, Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. For a moment, she forgot where she was, expecting to see her familiar bedroom in Boston. Reality crashed back as she took in the simple furnishings of the boarding house room. After dressing in a practical brown skirt and white blouse, She made her way downstairs. Mrs. Miller was already in the kitchen, frying bacon and mixing batter for pancakes. "Good morning, dear. Sleep well." "Better than I expected," Eleanor admitted. "Can I help with breakfast?" "You can set the table if you like. Plates are in that cupboard." As Eleanor arranged plates and silverware, Mrs. Miller studied her thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about your situation. What skills do you have, dear?" Eleanor considered the question. "I was a teacher in Boston. I also play the piano, so reasonably well, and can keep accounts." Mrs. Miller's face brightened. "A teacher? Well, that's fortunate. Our school teacher, Miss Jenkins, has been wanting an assistant. The town's growing, and she has too many children to manage alone." Hope flickered in Eleanor's chest. "Do you think she might consider me?" "I'm certain of it. We'll speak to her after breakfast." The morning passed quickly. Eleanor met with the young schoolteacher, Sarah Jenkins, who was delighted at the prospect of having help. The school board would need to approve, but Sarah was confident it wouldn't be a problem. "The pay isn't much," Sarah warned, "but it should cover your board and some necessities." "That's all I need right now," Eleanor assured her. As they left the small schoolhouse, Eleanor spotted a familiar figure on horseback coming down the street. Wade Callahan tipped his hat when he saw her, guiding his horse in their direction. "Miss Blackwood," he greeted her. "Settling in all right?" "Yes, thank you," Eleanor replied, suddenly conscious of her appearance. "Miss Jenkins has kindly offered me a position at the school." Wade smiled, that small dimple appearing again. "That's good news. This town could use more educated folks." "Mr. Callahan," Sarah said, "since you're here, would you mind checking the schoolhouse roof? I noticed a leak during the last rain." "Be happy to, Miss Jenkins. I'll take a look this afternoon." He turned back to Eleanor. "Glad to see Dry Creek's taking care of you, Miss Blackwood." As he rode away, Sarah gave Eleanor a knowing look. "Wade Callahan is quite the catch. Half the unmarried women in town have set their caps for him." "I'm not interested in catching anyone," Eleanor said firmly. "I came here to get married, and look how that turned out." Sarah's expression softened. "Of course, I didn't mean to presume." They walked back toward the boarding house in silence. Eleanor was troubled by her reaction to Sarah's innocent comment. Why had she responded so defensively? Wade was simply being kind to a stranger in need. There was nothing more to it. That afternoon, Eleanor wrote a letter to her friend Margaret in Boston, explaining what had happened and asking her to make inquiries about Frederick. Had something happened to prevent him from meeting her? Or had he simply changed his mind? She needed to know, even if the truth hurt. After posting the letter, Eleanor wandered through the small town, familiarizing herself with her new surroundings. The general store, the bank, the sheriff's office, the saloon, which she passed quickly, and finally, the small church at the edge of town. The church door was open, and Eleanor stepped inside, welcoming the cool, quiet interior. She sat in a pew, gathering her thoughts and trying to make peace with her situation. "Seeking answers, Miss Blackwood?" a gentle voice asked. Eleanor turned to see an older man in clerical attire. "Just some quiet, Reverend Thomas Parker," he introduced himself. "And sometimes quiet is the best way to find answers." "I'm not sure what questions I'm asking anymore," Eleanor admitted. The Reverend sat beside her. "Mrs. Miller told me about your circumstances. A difficult trial, to be sure. I keep wondering what I did wrong," Eleanor said softly. "Was there a sign I missed? Something I should have known?" "Sometimes there are no signs," Reverend Parker replied. "People make choices we can't predict or understand. But I believe that even our disappointments can lead us to where we're meant to be." Eleanor wasn't sure she believed that, but she appreciated his kindness. "Thank you, Reverend. You're welcome at Sunday services, of course. And the Ladies' Aid Society meets on Wednesday afternoons. They're a good group, might help you feel more at home here." As Eleanor left the church, she spotted Wade on the schoolhouse roof, repairing the leak as promised. He waved when he saw her, and she found herself waving back before continuing on her way. The next few days fell into a routine. Eleanor assisted Sarah at the school in the mornings, helping the younger children with their reading while Sarah worked with the older students. In the afternoons, she helped Mrs. Miller with chores at the boarding house to offset some of her expenses. On her fourth day in Dry Creek, Eleanor was returning from the school when she heard someone call her name. She turned to see Wade approaching, leading his horse. "Afternoon, Miss Blackwood. How are you finding life in our little town?" "It's different," she replied honestly. But everyone has been very kind. Wade nodded. Small towns can be nosy, but they rally around folks in need. He hesitated. I was wondering if you might like to see a bit more of the area. Sunday after church, perhaps? Eleanor was surprised by the invitation. I wouldn't want to impose on your time. It's no imposition. There's a nice spot by the creek where folks sometimes have picnics. Thought you might enjoy getting out of town for a spell. The offer was tempting. Eleanor had been feeling confined, despite the vastness of the landscape surrounding Dry Creek. That sounds lovely, actually. Thank you. Wade's smile widened. I'll come by the boarding house around 1, if that suits you. As he walked away, Eleanor felt a flutter of something she couldn't quite name. Not excitement. Surely she was still mourning the loss of her planned future with Frederick. But perhaps it was the first stirring of possibility, of a life different from the one she had imagined, but not without its own potential for happiness. Sunday arrived clear and mild. Eleanor attended church with Mrs. Miller, finding comfort in the familiar rituals even in this unfamiliar place. Reverend Parker's sermon on new beginnings seemed particularly apt, though she wondered if he had chosen the topic with her in mind. After the service, several townspeople introduced themselves, expressing sympathy for her situation and welcome to the community. By the time she returned to the boarding house to prepare for her outing with Wade, Eleanor was feeling more settled than she had since arriving in Dry Creek. She changed into a light green dress practical enough for a countryside excursion, but still flattering. Mrs. Miller provided a basket with sandwiches, apple tarts, and a jar of lemonade. Wade's a good man, Mrs. Miller said as she packed the food. Came here 5 years ago and worked hard to build his ranch from nothing. Lost his wife 2 years back. Influenza took her and their baby. Eleanor was surprised. I didn't realize he'd been married. He doesn't talk about it much. Threw himself into his work after Sarah and the baby died. This is the first time I've seen him show interest in spending time with anyone, especially a woman. Eleanor felt a weight of responsibility she hadn't anticipated. Mrs. Miller, I'm not looking for. That is, I just ended an engagement. Oh, I know, dear. Just thought you should know a bit about him. That's all. At precisely 1 o'clock, Wade arrived at the boarding house. He had cleaned up considerably. His shirt was pressed, his boots polished, and his hair neatly combed beneath a less weathered hat than the one he usually wore. Miss Blackwood, he greeted her, taking the basket Mrs. Miller handed him. Ready for your tour of the Wyoming countryside? I am, Eleanor replied with a smile. Though I should warn you, I'm not much of a horsewoman. Don't worry. We won't go far, and Buster here is gentle as they come. Wade helped her mount the horse, then swung up behind her. Eleanor stiffened slightly at the closeness, but there was nothing improper about his hold, one arm around her waist to steady her, the other holding the reins. They rode out of town, following a trail that led toward a line of cottonwood trees in the distance. The vastness of the landscape was both intimidating and exhilarating. In every direction, the land seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by occasional rock formations and distant mountains. It's so open, Eleanor commented. In Boston, you can't go a block without encountering buildings and people. That's what I love about it, Wade replied. Room to breathe. Room to be yourself without bumping into everyone else's expectations. They reached the creek after about 20 minutes of riding. It was a peaceful spot where the water widened to form a small pool before continuing its journey. Cottonwood trees provided shade, and wildflowers dotted the grassy bank. Wade helped Eleanor dismount, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary. He spread a blanket beneath a large cottonwood and set out the food Mrs. Miller had packed. As they ate, Wade told Eleanor about his journey west. He'd grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith, but had always felt drawn to open spaces. After serving in the Army for 3 years, he'd headed west, working as a ranch hand until he saved enough to buy his own small spread. What about you, he asked. What brought a Boston schoolteacher all the way out here, besides the fellow who didn't show? Eleanor told him about her parents, both teachers themselves, who had died within months of each other the previous year. About meeting Frederick Thompson when he came to Boston to arrange cattle shipments east, and his descriptions of Wyoming that had sounded so romantic and full of possibility. I should have known better, she admitted. We only spent a total of 3 weeks together, spread over his 3 visits to Boston. But after my parents died, I was so lonely, and Frederick painted such a vivid picture of the life we could have here. Wade's expression was understanding rather than judgmental. Loneliness can make us grab onto things we might otherwise think twice about. Was it like that for you? When you met your wife? Eleanor asked, then immediately regretted the question. I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller mentioned. I shouldn't have pried. It's all right, Wade said quietly. Sarah and I grew up together in the same town. Childhood sweethearts, you might say. When I decided to come west, she insisted on coming with me. We were happy here, until... He trailed off, his gaze turning to the creek. I'm sorry for your loss, Eleanor said softly. Wade nodded, then visibly shook off the melancholy. Tell me about teaching. Do you enjoy working with Miss Jenkins? The conversation turned to lighter topics: the children at the school, the characters in town, Wade's stories of learning to ranch in a landscape so different from the eastern farms. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found herself laughing more than she had in months. When it was time to return, Wade packed up the remains of their picnic. As Eleanor watched him secure the basket to his saddle, she realized she'd enjoyed herself immensely. More than that, she'd felt comfortable with Wade in a way she hadn't expected. The ride back to town was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the boarding house, Eleanor finally broke the silence. Thank you for today. It was exactly what I needed. Wade's arm tightened slightly around her waist. My pleasure, Miss Blackwood. Eleanor, she corrected him. After spending an afternoon together, I think you can call me Eleanor. She could hear the smile in his voice as he replied, Eleanor it is, then. The weeks that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Eleanor continued working at the school, gradually taking on more responsibilities as Sarah recognized her skills. The children responded well to her, and she found herself enjoying teaching in this small, mixed-age classroom more than she had in the regimented Boston school. Wade came to town every few days, often finding reasons to stop by the school or the boarding house. Sometimes he brought small gifts, wildflowers he'd picked along the trail, a book he thought she might enjoy, once even a jar of honey from the hives a neighboring rancher kept. Every Sunday after church, they rode out together, exploring different parts of the surrounding countryside. Eleanor discovered hidden valleys, climbed rocky outcroppings for breathtaking views, and learned to identify the local plants and wildlife under Wade's patient tutelage. She also became more involved in the community, joining the Ladies' Aid Society and helping organize a small harvest festival as autumn deepened. The townsfolk accepted her as one of their own, and Eleanor found herself thinking of Dry Creek as home. 6 weeks after her arrival, a letter finally came from Margaret in Boston. Eleanor took it to her room, hands trembling as she broke the seal. Margaret had indeed made inquiries about Frederick Thompson. What she discovered was disturbing. Frederick had apparently been engaged to at least 2 other women in different towns, promising each a life together before disappearing with whatever money or valuables he could convince them to invest in their future. I'm so sorry, my dear Eleanor, Margaret wrote. It seems Mr. Thompson is nothing but a confidence man who preys on vulnerable women. You are fortunate that you discovered his true nature before you were legally bound to him, though I know this brings little comfort given your current circumstances. Eleanor sat on her bed, the letter clutched in her hands. Strangely, she felt more relief than heartbreak. The uncertainty had been worse than knowing the truth, even a truth this painful. Frederick hadn't been delayed or met with an accident. He had never intended to marry her at all. That evening at dinner, Mrs. Miller noticed her subdued mood. Bad news from Boston, dear? Eleanor nodded, then decided the truth was best. It seems my fiancé was a fraud. He's done the same thing to other women, convinced them to sell everything and come west to marry him, then abandoned them. Gasps and murmurs of sympathy came from the other boarders. At least I still have most of my money, Eleanor added. I was cautious enough to keep it with me rather than sending it ahead, as he suggested. What will you do now? Mrs. Miller asked. Will you return to Boston? The question gave Eleanor pause. What did she want to do? Boston held nothing for her now, no family, no home, just memories of a life that had ended with her parents' deaths. I think I'll stay, she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. I enjoy teaching here, and I've made friends. There's nothing for me in Boston anymore. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about her decision to stay in Dry Creek. It wasn't just the teaching position or the friendships she'd formed, though those were important. There was something else keeping her here, or rather, someone. Wade Callahan had become a significant part of her life in a very short time. His steady presence, his kindness without expectation, his quiet strength, all of these drew her to him in a way she had never been drawn to Frederick. With Frederick, there had been excitement and passion, but also an underlying desperation born of grief and loneliness. With Wade, there was a calm certainty, a feeling of rightness she hadn't experienced before. The next day after school, Eleanor walked to the telegraph office and sent a message to Margaret, explaining her decision to stay in Wyoming. As she left the office, she nearly collided with Wade, who was just coming in. "Eleanor, I was just about to send a message to Cheyenne about some cattle I'm buying." His smile faded as he studied her face. "Everything all right?" "Yes," she replied. "I received a letter from Boston yesterday. It confirmed what I already suspected. Frederick never intended to marry me. He's apparently done this before." Wade's expression darkened. "What kind of man does that to a woman?" "The kind I'm well rid of," Eleanor said firmly. "I've decided to stay in Dry Creek. I've just sent word to my friend in Boston." The tension in Wade's shoulders eased. "That's good news. For the town, I mean. And the school. And for you?" Eleanor asked boldly. Wade's eyes widened slightly, then a slow smile spread across his face. "Especially for me." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, until someone clearing their throat behind them broke the spell. Wade stepped aside to let a man enter the telegraph office, then offered Eleanor his arm. "May I walk you back to the boarding house?" "Actually," Eleanor said, "I'd like to see your ranch. You've talked about it so much, but I've never seen it." Wade hesitated. "It's not much to look at yet. Nothing like the fancy houses you probably knew in Boston. I'd still like to see it, if you're willing to show me." 20 minutes later, they were riding east of town. The landscape changed subtly as they went, the flat plains giving way to gently rolling hills dotted with junipers and pines. After about 3 miles, Wade pointed to a cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley. "There it is. Callahan Ranch." It was modest compared to some of the larger spreads Eleanor had heard about, but it had a welcoming appearance. A small but sturdy log house stood near a creek, with a barn, corral, and a few outbuildings nearby. A vegetable garden was visible beside the house, and smoke curled from the chimney. "You have someone living here?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "My ranch hand, Eduardo, and his wife Maria. They take care of things when I'm away. Maria was a friend of my wife's, and they stayed on after." He didn't finish the sentence. They rode down to the house, where a middle-aged Mexican woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. "Señor Wade, we did not expect you today." Her eyes widened when she saw Eleanor. "And you bring a visitor?" "Maria, this is Miss Eleanor Blackwood. She's the new assistant teacher in town." "Eleanor, this is Maria Vasquez." Maria's warm brown eyes assessed Eleanor with open curiosity. "Welcome to Callahan Ranch, Miss Blackwood. Please, come inside. I have coffee on the stove." The interior of the house was simple but comfortable. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with chairs, and a few pieces of well-made furniture. 2 doors led off the main room, presumably to bedrooms. What caught Eleanor's eye, however, was the small piano in the corner. It was an upright model, not particularly fancy, but well-maintained. "You play?" she asked Wade, surprised. He shook his head. "Sarah did. I couldn't bear to part with it after she died." Maria served them coffee and freshly baked bread with honey, then discreetly made herself scarce, mentioning chores in the garden. "It's a lovely home, Wade," Eleanor said sincerely. "It needs a woman's touch," he replied, then looked embarrassed. "I mean, Sarah had plans for curtains and such that I never got around to." Eleanor smiled. "I think it's perfect just as it is. You've built something real here." Wade showed her around the rest of the property, the barn with its horses and milk cow, the small herd of cattle grazing on the hillside, the orchard he'd planted 2 years ago that was just beginning to bear fruit. "I've got about 100 acres now," he explained. "Not a big spread by Wyoming standards, but enough to make a decent living. I'm hoping to expand next year if the cattle prices hold." As they walked back toward the house, Wade suddenly stopped and turned to face her. "Eleanor, I need to say something." Her heart began to race at the seriousness in his tone. Yes, I know you've been through a lot. That business with Thompson, coming all this way only to be disappointed. I understand if you're not ready for anything else. He took a deep breath. But I want you to know that I care for you. More than I thought I could care for anyone after Sarah died. Eleanor felt tears welling in her eyes. Wade, you don't have to say anything now, he continued quickly. I just wanted you to know where I stand. I'm not going anywhere, and whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here. Impulsively, Eleanor stepped forward and placed her hand on his cheek. I care for you too, Wade. I didn't expect it, and maybe it's too soon after everything that's happened, but I can't deny what I feel. Wade covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a gentle kiss to her palm. That's all I needed to hear for now. The ride back to town was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence filled with new understanding. When they reached the boarding house, Wade helped her down from the horse, his hands lingering at her waist. Sunday after church? He asked softly. Eleanor nodded. I'll look forward to it. As autumn turned to winter, Eleanor and Wade's relationship deepened. They continued their Sunday outings when weather permitted, and Wade came to town more frequently, often staying for dinner at the boarding house. The townsfolk watched their courtship with approval. Wade was well respected, and Eleanor had quickly become a valued member of the community. In December, the school held a Christmas pageant, with all the children participating in a retelling of the nativity story. Wade sat in the front row, his face beaming with pride as Eleanor led the youngest children in a simple carol. After the performance, as parents collected their children and townspeople mingled over cups of hot cider, Wade pulled Eleanor aside. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. It's not much, but... He pressed a small package wrapped in brown paper into her hand. Eleanor unwrapped it carefully to reveal a silver brooch in the shape of a small wildflower. It's beautiful, she breathed, running her finger over the delicate petals. It reminded me of those flowers you liked so much by the creek, Wade explained. The ones that were still blooming when everything else had gone to seed. Eleanor pinned the brooch to her dress, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. Thank you, Wade. I'll treasure it. There's something else, he said, suddenly looking nervous. I've been thinking. The ranch is doing well, and with spring coming, I'll need to focus more on the cattle. Coming into town so often takes time away from the work. Eleanor felt a pang of disappointment. I understand. We don't have to see each other so frequently. That's not what I meant, Wade said quickly. Eleanor, I'm asking if you'll marry me. Come live at the ranch, be my wife. I know it's not what you imagined when you came west, but I promise to be a good husband to you. Eleanor stared at him, speechless. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately. She loved Wade, had grown to love him more each day they spent together. But another part hesitated, remembering how quickly she had agreed to marry Frederick. Wade seemed to read her thoughts. You don't have to answer now. Take some time to think about it. I want you to be sure. Eleanor reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. It's not that I don't care for you, Wade. I do very much. But yes, I need a little time. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. That night, Eleanor lay awake in her room at the boarding house, turning Wade's proposal over in her mind. Was she ready for marriage? Was it too soon after the disaster with Frederick? But Frederick and Wade were nothing alike. Frederick had been charming and exciting, full of grand plans and sweeping gestures. Wade was steady and honest, a man whose actions spoke louder than his words. Frederick had made her feel desired. Wade made her feel valued. By morning, Eleanor had made her decision. After breakfast, she asked Mrs. Miller for permission to use the parlor for a private conversation. When Wade arrived for their usual Sunday outing, she led him there instead of out to his waiting horse. I've been thinking about your proposal, she began once they were seated. Wade nodded, his expression carefully neutral. And I would be honored to be your wife, Wade Callahan. The joy that spread across his face was beautiful to behold. He took her hands in his, bringing them to his lips. You've made me the happiest man in Wyoming, Eleanor Blackwood. There's just one condition, she added. Wade raised an eyebrow. Name it. I'd like to continue teaching, at least until the end of the school year. I don't want to leave Miss Jenkins without help. Of course, Wade agreed readily. We can work out the details. Maybe I could drive you into town on those days. They decided on a February wedding, giving them time to prepare and for Eleanor to fulfill her commitment to the school. Reverend Parker was delighted to perform the ceremony, and the entire town seemed to throw itself into the preparations. The Ladies' Aid Society insisted on helping Eleanor with her wedding dress and new one, as she had packed away the one she'd worn while waiting for Frederick, unable to bear the sight of it. Christmas and New Year passed in a blur of happiness. Wade joined Eleanor and the boarding house residents for Christmas dinner, bringing Maria's tamales as his contribution to the feast. For New Year's, he took Eleanor to a dance at the town hall, where they whirled around the floor until midnight, stealing a kiss as the clock struck 12. In January, Wade began making improvements to the ranch house, adding a second bedroom for guests, though Eleanor suspected he was thinking of children in their future. He also ordered new curtains and linens from the general store, determined that Eleanor would have a proper home to come to. 2 weeks before the wedding, Eleanor received another letter from Margaret. This one contained surprising news: Frederick Thompson had been arrested in Denver for fraud and was facing a significant prison sentence. Several of his victims had come forward, and the authorities were building a strong case against him. "Should you wish to add your testimony," Margaret wrote, "the prosecutor believes it would strengthen their case. However, I understand if you prefer to leave that chapter of your life firmly closed." Eleanor showed the letter to Wade that evening as they sat by the fire in Mrs. Miller's parlor. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. Wade considered the question carefully. "It's your decision, Eleanor. But if it were me, I want to make sure he couldn't hurt anyone else the way he hurt you." Eleanor nodded. "That's what I was thinking too. I'll write to the prosecutor tomorrow." Wade squeezed her hand. "I'm proud of you. Not many would have the strength to face something like this." "I'm not the same woman who stepped off that train 6 months ago," Eleanor replied. "I'm stronger now. Happier too." As their wedding day approached, Eleanor found herself surprisingly calm. There were no doubts, no second thoughts, just a quiet certainty that she was making the right choice. The night before the wedding, Mrs. Miller insisted on following the tradition that the groom shouldn't see the bride. Wade reluctantly agreed, kissing Eleanor goodnight with a promise to meet her at the church the next day. "Don't leave me waiting at the altar," Eleanor teased. Wade's expression grew serious. "Never. Wild horses couldn't keep me away." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cold, with fresh snow blanketing the ground. Eleanor dressed carefully in her new wedding gown, a simple but elegant creation of ivory satin with lace trim. Mrs. Miller helped her arrange her hair, weaving small white flowers into the dark curls. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Miller said, dabbing at her eyes. "Wade is a fortunate man." "I'm the fortunate one," Eleanor replied, thinking of how her life had changed since that lonely afternoon at the train station. At precisely noon, Eleanor entered the small church on the arm of the elderly banker, who had kindly offered to give her away. The building was packed with townsfolk, all smiling as she made her way toward the altar where Wade stood waiting. He looked handsome in a new black suit, his hair neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. But it was the expression in his eyes that took Eleanor's breath away, a mixture of love, pride, and wonder that made her heart swell. Reverend Parker conducted the ceremony with warmth and humor, speaking of new beginnings and God's plan for bringing people together in unexpected ways. When it came time for the vows, Wade's voice was steady and sure as he promised to love, honor, and cherish Eleanor for all the days of his life. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Parker declared. "You may kiss your bride." Wade gently lifted Eleanor's veil, his eyes never leaving hers as he leaned down to seal their union with a tender kiss. The church erupted in applause and cheers, and Eleanor felt tears of joy slipping down her cheeks. The celebration continued at the town hall, where tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by everyone in the community. There was music and dancing, laughter and toasts, as Dry Creek celebrated the union of two people who had found each other against all odds. As the afternoon waned, Wade and Eleanor prepared to leave for the ranch, their home now. The ladies of the town gathered around Eleanor for the traditional throwing of the bouquet, which was caught by a blushing Sarah Jenkins. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Callahan?" Wade asked, offering his arm. The name sent a thrill through Eleanor. "Yes, Mr. Callahan, I believe I am." Wade had borrowed a sleigh for the occasion, complete with bells and warm blankets for the journey. As they glided over the snow-covered landscape, Eleanor leaned against her husband's shoulder, contentment filling her heart. "Happy?" Wade asked, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. The ranch looked magical in the winter twilight, with lanterns glowing in the windows and smoke curling from the chimney. Maria and Eduardo had prepared the house for their arrival, with a fire blazing in the hearth and a special supper waiting on the table. They had discreetly made themselves scarce, moving temporarily to one of the outbuildings to give the newlyweds privacy. Wade carried Eleanor over the threshold, setting her down gently in what was now their home. He had made many small improvements since she'd last visited. New curtains hung at the windows, a colorful quilt adorned the bed visible through the open bedroom door, and a vase of winter greenery sat on the table. But what brought tears to Eleanor's eyes was the piano. It had been polished to a high shine, and a new piece of sheet music sat on the rack, a wedding waltz. "I thought you might like to play again," Wade said softly. "Sarah would have wanted the piano to bring joy to this house." Eleanor sat on the bench, running her fingers over the keys. The piano was perfectly tuned. She began to play the waltz, and Wade stood behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. When she finished, he helped her to her feet and took her in his arms. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Callahan?" They danced slowly in the firelight, no music but the beating of their hearts. As Wade held her close, Eleanor marveled at the journey that had brought her here. From the disappointment and humiliation of being abandoned at the train station to the joy of being in the arms of a man who truly loved her. "What are you thinking?" Wade asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "I was thinking about the day we met," Eleanor replied. "How lost I felt, and how you took my hand and led me home. I just didn't realize then that home would be with you." Wade's arms tightened around her. "The moment I saw you standing there in your wedding dress, looking so brave despite everything, I knew you were someone special. I think I started falling in love with you right then, even though I was meant to marry another man. Especially then," Wade said, "because I could see what kind of woman you were, strong enough to travel across the country on your own, determined enough to make a new life when your plans fell apart. Those aren't qualities you find every day." Eleanor reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "I love you, Wade Callahan." "And I love you, Eleanor Callahan," he replied, bending to kiss her with a tenderness that spoke of all the days and years to come. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the tracks of their sleigh and creating a clean white blanket over the land. Inside, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the newlyweds as they began their life together. 5 years later, Eleanor stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Wade taught their 4-year-old son William to ride his pony in the corral. Their 2-year-old daughter Emily played at her feet, carefully arranging pebbles and patterns only she understood. The ranch had prospered under Wade's careful management. The herd had grown to several hundred head of cattle, and last year they had added sheep as well. The original house had been expanded, with 2 more bedrooms added for the children and a proper parlor where Eleanor's piano now stood. Eleanor herself divided her time between the ranch and town, still teaching 2 days a week at the school. She had also started a small lending library in a corner of the general store, using books donated by townsfolk and ordered from catalogs. Life wasn't always easy. There had been a difficult winter, a season of drought, and Emily's difficult birth that had left Eleanor bedridden for weeks. But through it all, Wade had been her rock, just as she had been his when times were hard. As she watched her husband and son, Eleanor's mind drifted back to that day at the train station. How devastated she had been, how certain that her life was ruined. If someone had told her then that in 5 years she would be happier than she'd ever imagined possible, she would never have believed it. Wade looked up, catching her eye across the yard. He smiled, that same warm smile that had first touched her heart, and waved. Eleanor waved back, her heart full. That evening, after the children were asleep, Wade and Eleanor sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. Wade's arm was around her shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him. "I got a letter from the bank today," Wade said. "They've approved the loan for that piece of land to the north." "That's wonderful news," Eleanor replied. "You've been wanting that parcel for years." Wade nodded. "It's good grazing land, and it has that stream running through it. will help during the dry season. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft hooting of an owl, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods by the creek. Are you happy, Eleanor? Wade asked suddenly. With this life, I mean. It's not what you came west expecting. Eleanor turned to look at him, surprised by the question. Wade Callahan, are you still worrying about that after 5 years of marriage? He shrugged, a bit sheepishly. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if that Thompson fellow had shown up that day. You'd have married him, never known what he was really like until it was too late. Or maybe I would have seen through him eventually, Eleanor countered. Either way, it doesn't matter now. This is the life I was meant to have with you, with our children, in this place. Wade kissed her then, a kiss full of tenderness and gratitude. You know, I thank God every day for making that train late. Eleanor laughed softly. The train wasn't late, Wade. Frederick simply wasn't on it. Well, then I thank God for Frederick Thompson being a no-good scoundrel, Wade amended with a grin. His loss was definitely my gain. As they went inside, hand in hand, Eleanor took one last look at the starlit landscape surrounding their home. From disappointment had come joy. From abandonment had come belonging. From an ending had come the most beautiful beginning. The bride who had been left waiting at the station had found her true destination after all, in the arms of a cowboy who had taken her hand and led her home.